So today we're going to study the targeting weight loss in cheesemaking to increase your profit. The point of this webinar for just an hour. It's normally a much longer session, few days with some experiments and trials and on-site testings. But today we are going to cover it rapidly in 1 hour in order to understand why do we need to increase the volume of cheese, or do we really need to increase the quantity of cheese that we make in order to be able to pay the bills at the end of the year. Occasionally I visit cheesemakers and they tell me that well, financially it's getting quite hard for them and they need to produce more and more. And when we study a little bit more their efficiency of being able to process the milk into cheese, we realize that their efficiency is quite poor. And just by working on increasing their efficiency, most of the time it permits to regulate this financial problem. And then in this case, the growth after can be done. But if you analyze your economics and notice that you are losing money each time you process milk, of course, the more milk you process in the dairy, the more money you will lose at the end of the year. So we will see where how we can analyze these economics and where we can some problems. So this will permit to identify, in the first case, the cheese making yield, and then where do you lose money, the production cost. And that's the question that we just underlined. Do I need to grow to make more money? And how much does it cost me to produce 1 kilo of cheese? Do I use the maximum potential of my milk? And finally, where do I lose money? In order to be able to check yields and adjust the milk according to the season, diet, sanitary conditions, we need to define the cheese characteristics. What are the main parameters in the cheese that you need to know, that you need to measure and analyze, and that will have a direct impact, not on the cheese quality only, but also on the final ability to process the milk into cheese. And those main objectives are pH, fat content, MFFB, so MFFB for moisture in fat-free basis, and the fat and dry matter as well. We have just a quick graph with the evolution of the ratio of fat and proteins according to the lactation stage. We see that the composition in milk is changing throughout the year. The ratio of fat divided by proteins going up and down depending on the season, the diet, the type of animal, of course. But this means that we should adjust the way that we make the cheese according to this ratio. This is one of the parameters to track. So when we characterize a cheese, we have to divide the cheese into three main families. We have the moisture, the water that we have in the cheese. We have the dry matter, the total dry matter, that is 100 minus the moisture. And inside the dry matter, we have two different parts, the fatty parts and the non-fatty parts, the non-fat dry matter. In order to get those values, we need to be able to analyze the cheese with fat and moisture. This is where the SCIO device will be very interesting to help the cheesemaker to analyze the cheese regularly in order to have a database of moisture and fat. We already had a webinar on this tool in last autumn. Fat. The fat in cheese will affect various parameters like texture, creaminess, melting, aroma development. Fat is very, very important in terms of aromatic profile. It's a very strong precursor of aromas, but the quantity of fat in the cheese will affect directly the aging ability. If we see on the graph on the bottom, we have two cheeses, different cheeses, but they have the same level of moisture. Both cheese have a moisture of 50%, the blue part, but one cheese has more fat, the second cheese has less fat. The impact will be the difference in terms of fat on dry matter for 60% versus 40%. This will have a direct impact on the final texture of the cheese in the first point, but also will have a very important impact on the aging ability of the cheese, because the fat being hydrophobic, all the water that we have in the cheese will be linked to the non-fat part of the cheese, so to the green part. So the smaller the green part, the non-fat dry matter, that is 90% constituted of proteins, the smaller this part, with the same quantity of water, the more hydrated are the proteins. It means the cheese, this water will be more available for the bacteriological development, so we'll have a much quicker aging profile. This is what we want to understand when we do the MFFB, the moisture in fat-free basis. That has a direct consequence on the aging profile. In terms of moisture, the MFFB represents the moisture content in a non-fat cheese. It indicates how the cheese will behave during aging. So we'll modify the proteolysis and lipolysis activity, influence on aging agent, bacteria, yeast, mold, and also the enzymes that they release, and the aging speed. The higher the value of MFFB, example 75% for a traditional camembert, 71, 72% for a modern camembert, and 67, 68 for a brie, classic brie. So the higher the value, the more water is available for all biological and biochemical reaction, the enzymatic activity, so faster the aging process. So if you make a cheese, you should look for a constant MFFB in order to have a constant aging profile of your cheese. If one batch is aging quicker than another batch, the management in the aging part of your business will be really complicated to release cheese with the same aging profile on the market. The higher the moisture in the final cheese, the higher the yield, because you sell water at the price of cheese, which is the best part of cheese making. But the control of the aging process becomes hazardous. You will start to have rind problems, contaminants, or flavors. The cheese will become wild because it aged too fast according to its needs. So we need to adjust the production parameters to reestablish drainage objectives, the drainage in vat, mainly the acidification, and eventually the salting. So we have the example of the classic camembert with the fat on dry matter 45%. It's not the AOP camembert, right? The AOP camembert, being a moister, more lactic cheese, will have a slightly higher MFFB, closer to 72 to 75. We are here more in the commercial camembert with a bit more stability, with longer shelf life. You understand that the higher the MFFB value, the faster the aging process, but also the shorter the shelf life of the cheese. So we have to be careful when we look for higher MFFB value to fasten the aging profile. This will have a direct impact of decreasing the shelf life of the cheese. So in order to calculate the MFFB, we need the moisture divided by the non-fat cheese, which is 100 minus fat. So in this example in here, the fat is 19.8 grams or percent. The moisture is 56. So we do 56 divided by 100 minus 19.8, and we get the MFFB at 70%. Sorry. So for a given cheese, like in this example, the camembert, we can allow a plus or minus 2 points. NFCM for non-fat cheese moisture. You will see a couple of different acronyms to explain the MFFB. It's exactly the same thing. So don't be surprised if you see NFCM, NFCH as well for non-fat cheese humidity. But the most common acronym that is used is the MFFB, moisture in fat-free basis, but all indicates the same value. So minus 2 points less than 68%, the cheese is too dry, ripening longer, less flavor, and less aroma development. If it's too high, you will have more than 70%. 72%, sorry. The cheese to humid, ripening faster, less control, stronger flavor. This is most of the time the first characteristics of a cheese. In the hard cheese family or semi-hard cheese family, the cheese become hot, spicy, wild, with a lot of histamine flavor production. And this is most of the time linked to an excessive aging profile, way too fast or too strong. And the first thing to control in this case is the MFFB of the cheese. Cheese-making yields are the mathematical expression of the quantity of cheese produced with a defined quantity of milk. That's the gross technological yield, or the cheese-making yield. We use usually kilos of cheese per 100 liters of milk, or kilos of cheese per 100 kilos of milk. In this case, we need to know the density of the milk, which is more precise for small dairies. Let's say less than 500 liters of milk per day, it's not going to be that significant. But if you start to process bigger volumes, in this case, you should convert liters of milk into kilos of milk to have kilos of cheese per kilos of milk. So you have the density of 1.028 ish, then you multiply by the volume of milk. We have a specific device to measure the density of the milk. In case of cheese with fixed weight, like Camembert 250 grams, we can express it as liters of milk per cheese. The classic value or target for Camembert is 2.1, 2.2 liters of milk per cheese. Integrating a technical approach, we need to consider yield recovery coefficient and losses. The yield recovery coefficient are the coefficient that will express the recovery of fat. You have a certain amount of fat that enters in the cheese vat with the milk. You have a certain amount of fat that goes out of the cheese vat in the cheese. What's the percentage of recovery? Have you collected 90% of the fat that you had in the milk, of the fat that you had in the milk, sorry? 75%, 80%, 85%, where are you in terms of recovery coefficient? And we need to control also the loss of total weight during the process, salting and aging. The loss of cheese during aging are called freins. It's a very specific word in French that is used only to define the weight loss during aging. Very specific to cheese. Technological yield. It's not the cheese making yield, it's the other one. There is the cheese making yield, it's what you do. The technological yield is what you should do. This technological yield focus only on the performance of milk transformation into cheese, into fresh non-salted cheese. So you need to do those checking with the SCIO device or any other conventional method to measure fat and moisture at unmolding, because doing it at unmolding, you will be able to assess your cheese making efficiency. Then when you start adding salt, this modifies the moisture level. And if you start aging the cheese, you don't know if the cheese evolution or the cheese composition later on will be the consequence of your cheese making ability or the aging ability of your roe. So this yield requires the weight or an evaluation of the volume of milk, as well as the total weight of cheese produced with this volume of milk. So weighting the cheese takes place at the end of drainage and before salting. If you want to present the results in kilos of milk, necessary to multiply the volume of milk by its density at 20, which is between 1.27, 1.032, 1.034. The more fat you have in the milk, the lighter the density. And we'll check the yield recovery coefficient. So this is what we just talked before. You have a quantity of ingredients. So this technique can be used by for any constituent of milk. Can be fat, can be proteins, can be dry matter, sugars or minerals. But in terms of yield tracking, we will be doing it only mainly for fat and proteins. So what we want to know, how do we calculate the yield recovery coefficient? We need the mass of cheese times the concentration, example fat, concentration of fat in the cheese, divided by mass of milk times concentration of fat in the milk times 100. If we take the example just below, we have 100 kilos of milk at 4% fat, producing 12 kilos of cheese at 30% fat. The yield coefficient, therefore, is 12 times 30 divided by 100 times 4 equals 90%. It means that we have been able to collect 90% of the fat that entered in the cheese vat in the cheese. We've lost 10% of the total fat during the cheese production, which is a good value. In here, that's a homemade Excel template with my very, very poor ability of playing with computers. I tried to make myself a small template that will summarize everything that we talked about. So technically on this template, we need to fill the green cells, the fat in milk, the proteins in milk, the volume of milk on the top left, in grams per liter, because we will convert it into kilos of cheese. So we don't play with percentage in here, we play with grams per liter, which is the percentage of fat times 10, and you get the grams per liter. Fat in cheese, 36%, dry matter in cheese, 62%, number of cheese 1, and the weight in terms of kilo, the cheese at unmolding is 26 kilo. So when we enter those values, those green cells into the Excel template, this guy tells us that the yield coefficient, we have the input of milk and the output that goes with the cheese. In this case, we have, if we look at the total fat line, the actual yield recovery coefficient is 74.4%, and the target is about 90%. If we look at the non-fat dry extract, which is 90% constituted by proteins. So when we measure cheese, we can measure the non-fat dry matter, we can measure the moisture, the dry extract, and the fat, but we cannot directly easily measure the exact quantity of proteins. So we make an approximation of saying that proteins are 90% of the non-fat dry extract. The other 10% are salt, minerals, lactates that we have in the cheese. But 90% being a pretty close value and kind of a constant in cheese. So we see in this case that the non-fat dry extract yield coefficient is 63.57% with a target of 75%. So being a good cheesemaker, we should have collected 90% of fat, and we did 74%. For proteins, we did 75%. We should do 75% of yield recovery, and we did 63%. So it means two things. We've been losing fat during the process, and we've been losing proteins during the process. If we look on the bottom right, what we have in terms of MFFB, we have a 59% MFFB. The target is more like 54. So the cheese either is too moist or has too much fat to be related to the composition of the milk, to the fat and dry matter. You can see with those values, 55.9 and 38.9 for proteins. This milk is very likely to be a Jersey milk, right? So we probably have a milk that is not right balanced. If we look at the ratio fat divided by proteins for this one, it gives us 55.5. divided by 38.9. It gives us a ratio of 1.44. A ratio of 144 for this type of cheese is a technical disaster. So we end up, we start with a milk that has too much fat according proteins. So we have a milk that will not permit to coagulate well, to drain well. So we'll have moisture problems, excessive fat. And like I used to say, when you have too much fat in the milk, you lose yield. That's the direct consequence. We are not able to collect all of the fat. And simply by reducing the fat in the milk to start with for this type of cheese, we should see a much better result in terms of economics in this zone. The yield that we do is an 11.2 actual yield. The target should be a 12.2. So the targeted yield is made assuming that we have the targeted yield coefficient. If you add a 90% fat recovery and a 75% proteins recovery, you should be making 12.2% yield instead of 11.2. So it means 1 point different. For 225 liters of milk start to be significant, 1 kilo of cheese per 100 liters of milk. So for this volume, we should make 2.5 kilos of cheese more for a cheese that is going to be sold, depending the country, at more or less high price at the end of the year. It can make a very significant amount of money. So with this template, we've been able to identify that we are losing fat in here and proteins in here. So we are going to work now, where do I lose fat, where do I lose proteins? So we've identified the fat and proteins ratio, but we have to go deeper into it. The first point, loss of proteins. Where do we know? Where does the literature says that we lose proteins? The first parameter will be the subclinical mastitis. We have a direct relationship between the quantity of caseins with the quantity of somatic cells. So if we look at the graph, with the milk having less than 100,000 somatic cells, we have caseins in the milk being 28.1 grams per liter. Remember, the caseins are usually about 75–70% of the total proteins. And then the more the somatic cells increase, the lower the quantity of caseins. So we have a direct relationship in terms of economics and a big interest in focusing on the quantity of somatic cells, not only because it can be an indicator of animals' health, but also because it has a direct financial impact. Mastitis on cheesemaking yields. So those values have been made with sheep's milk. When we have milk production in kilo with a healthy udder, we have 0.77 liters or kilo per udder. When it's infected, the quantity of milk collapse, we produce half less milk. Somatic cells multiply by 16, so there is a direct impact on the casein level. The casein decreased by 12%, and the fat decreased by 5% as well. So you have less milk, we have much more somatic cells, and less caseins and less fat. Of course, we're going to say, well, but we don't use the milk when we have mastitis. But what about the subclinical mastitis, when you don't see it, when you don't see it yet, and you start to have the problems in here? That's why a regular subclinical mastitis identification in the herd is going to be very important. Doing a CMT type test or others, well, this is doable when you have 20, 30, 50 cows. But when you start to have 100 to 200,000 cows, you cannot physically do a CMT test. So the lower, the smaller the hurt, the easier to control the quality of the milk, of course. The impact of somatic cells on cheesemaking yield. We'll see the technological yield, the lowest line compared to the somatic cells. We have a direct impact. We lose 1 point with an increase of 10% in terms of somatic cells. So even if we say that usually in small ruminants, the quantity of somatic cells is not that problematic, is not as problematic as cow. It has less a direct indicator of animals' health, but we still notice some drop in terms of yield. Total bacteria. So this is an old study. Look, that was made by Bernard Mieton, that was the head lecturer at Poligny in 1977. So quite old. Influence of milk proteolysis by psychotrophic bacteria on cheese making yield in soft cheese production. So the study was to study the impact of Pseudomonas, cold-loving bacteria in the milk, into the cheese making yield. The more Pseudomonas we have, the lower the yield. So this is what the summary is. When the milk is poorly contaminated by psychotrophic bacteria during milking, these populations stay minoritary. If this family becomes greater than 10% of the total flora, how they would grow by storing the milk. So you contaminate the milk at the beginning with the pipelines, with the contaminated water, whatever the initial source of Pseudomonas, psychotrophic bacteria. If you permit this family of bacteria to grow during the cold storage in milk, the yield coefficient will drop by 5% after 4 days. 4 days of storage for a milk that has less than 2,500 colony forming units per milliliter of psychotrophic. So this is important to know when we say, oh, my milk is clean, we have 20,000 or 30,000 bacteria in the milk. That's quite on the low side. But in this 20,000 bacteria, if we have 20,000 psychotrophic, that's unlikely to be the case because you will have a lot of other bugs. But the more you permit for this bacteria to grow, the less money you make at the end of the year, because those guys, they eat the proteins in the milk, they destroy the yield, and they release enzymes into the milk, like plasmin, that will destroy proteins, so will affect the cheese yield. Identification of Pseudomonas, how we can know if we have it. We can incubate the milk filter into a mason jar, or we can identify the coloration defect on cheese with a UV lamp. Pseudomonas will make a UV fluorescent color, but not only. It will also create some cadaverine smell, dead rat smell on the cheese, as well as a very bitter taste. But be careful, those three symptoms, so the fluorescent color, the smell, and the taste, can be disconnected. So you can have a normal smell and normal color, but having the bitterness, or you can have the color without bitterness. So those three parameters are not connected, are not linked. Age of milk, also, when you store the milk, we have an impact on Pseudomonas, on cold-loving bacteria that would grow and become dominant. The threshold is 48 hours. So if you want to really control the family of Pseudomonas, you should be using the milk within 48 hours. After 48 hours, the Pseudomonas start to develop and becomes dominant. The second impact on the age of milk and the storage at cold temperature is that you are going to lose calcium. The colloidal calcium that is connecting the casein micelle will start to go ionic, to move into the whey. And when we start to accumulate the ionic calcium, we start to have binding with phosphates, and it makes 3 calcium phosphates crystals into the milk, and that makes the milk stone on the surface of the cheese vat, on the surface of the mold. And as a milk stone shape in a crystal form, the calcium is no longer available for the coagulation. So you will lose curdling ability, curdling properties in your milk. So the gel will be softer, and you will increase the loss. If you want to reestablish this problem, the age, sorry, the age is not the only parameter that affects the quantity of calcium in the milk. You will have the cold temperature, the age, the heat treatment like pasteurization, as well as the acidification during milk's maturation when you want to make a soft cheese, as an example. So in this case, we can try to compensate by adding calcium chloride to reestablish the balance. Curdling mechanism. The curdling mechanism is very important to know the quantity of fat and the quantity of proteins. In other words, if you cut too soon, the curd will be too soft, and you will have a lot of fine particles that will be produced called fines, and those particles will be evacuated during the whey evacuation, during the weighing off. So you will lose a lot of particles in the whey, so directly the cheese yield collapse. In this case, it can be fat, because the fine particles will be bits of proteins, bits of curd, so it's directly proteins, but we also have fat in. And if the curd, is too firm, it will require too strong, a strong energetic reaction. You will need to be much more active in order to be able to cut, and in this case also, it will lead to fine particles development. So this is about the cutting moment, but there is also something important with the flock time that will affect the fat recovery, but we'll see it after doing the fat control. Acidification profiles. A fast acidification in the vat leads to curd's demineralization too soon in the process, in the vat. So what happened in the vat, if you acidify too fast, you split the calcium that was connected proteins. So the faster you acidify, the more you lose calcium at the early stage. So the more proteins or fine particles will be disconnected to the main blocks of grains of curd. So you will also lose money. If you make a ricotta after, fine, you will collect them, but be careful. The fine particles, the fine particles of curd in the ricotta will make a plasticky, gritty texture. So if it's not a problem for you, that's fine. If the texture of the ricotta is not good, in this case, you need to filter. You need to sieve those physical particles from the whey, because these are the ones that when you cook, the casings plastifies, and it makes gritty, kind of sandy texture in the ricotta. That's not nice. So in this case, you lose completely the fines. So summary of proteins lost during cheese making: mastitis, somatic cells, total flora and psychotrophic, age of milk and quantity of calcium, curdling mechanisms, cutting, stirring technique, and acidification profile. This is where proteins will be more affected. Fat. Where can we track down the loss of fat? The first parameter is the milk transfer. During cooling, then transport of milk, viscosity of fat globules gets thicker, increasing then the destruction power of mechanical shock. Each pump, valve, transfer, elbow, fall will contribute to degrade fat globus membrane, decreasing progressively the fat content. This picture is exactly what we don't want to see. The milk is falling instead of running over the wall. So we have a milk that will splash, and the foam on the surface of the milk is the sign of fat globules, the damage on the fat globules membrane. It releases the inner part of the fat globules, which are triglycerides, and those triglycerides are emulsifiers. That's why it makes foam on the surface of the milk. So if you see foam on the surface of the milk, it means that you have emulsifiers in, very likely to be triglycerides. So this is a direct sign of loss of money. The pumping, most of the time we have no choice, we have to pump the milk. When it's possible, we should pump hot milk instead of cold milk, because the hot milk will be less sensitive, the fat globules will be more flexible. Be careful, I had seen a cheesemaker using a CIP pump of 10,000 liters an hour for cleaning the pipeline and so on, for transferring 500 liters of milk. So this was needing a couple of minutes to transfer the whole volume of milk, but the milk, when it arrived in the cheese vat, was completely destroyed. Think of checking also at least once a year the inner part of the pump, the impeller. Feel and touch if you see or feel the scratches on the impellers, the turning parts. All those scratches will behave like blades that will shear and destroy the fat globules during transfer. Be careful also with the fibers that can be trapped in hay fibers or straw fibers that can be trapped in the turning part, and each time this fiber turns, it behaves like a blade that cuts everything, particularly the fat globules. Coagulation speed. Um, this is what we talked just before with the flop time. Very characteristic in cow's milk, the fat globules, of which membrane is rich in agglutinin, can agglomerate, producing bigger globule. So it's like having a balloon that gets bigger and bigger and bigger. The bigger the size of the balloon, the faster it rises. This is where we have a problem. The rise of fat during a slow coagulation profile will lead to a loss of cream on the surface of the curd. What do you do with this cream if you don't re-inject it in a way or the other into the curd? In this case, that's a direct loss of fat. So in this case, depending the type of milk and the type of cheese that you make, you should be coagulating faster, having a faster flow time with Jersey, because the Jersey fat globule is very big. And then you can, if you have a Dutch belt or Ayrshires with much smaller fat globules, in this case, those fat globules will rise slower, so you can have a longer flow time. So depending the type of cheese that you make, you will have to adjust this flocculation time. One of the three parameters that will impact the flocculation time, you remember, are the temperature, the quantity of rennet, and the pH at renneting. So depending the type of cheese you make, if you make a lactic cheese for Jersey milk, you should work at a higher temperature with a little bit more rennet, but not too much. Be careful with the rennet in lactic cheese. It prevents the drainage, but with a lower pH. So when I was making cheese with my Jerseys, the renneting pH for the lactic cheese was 5.9 and a curdling temperature of 23 in order to have a very fast entrapment of the fat in the curd. Another type of cheese being with a long flock time being the hard cooked cheese. When we have 20, 25, 30 minutes, these start to be problematic. We start to see a layer of fat on the surface of the milk, and it starts to be a direct sign of loss of fat in the cheese. So depending the cheese and depending the type of animals that you have, it can be problematic. This will not be so much of an issue with the goat's milk and sheep's milk, because we don't have the same agglutinins on the surface of the fat membrane. So those fat globules, they don't agglomerate together, so they stay quite small. So we have a much slower rise of fat globules in sheep and goat's milk. Summary of fat loss during cheesemaking. We'll need to focus on the mechanical shocks, the pumps, the transfer, how the milking machine itself, improper or damaged pump, coagulation speed to review, probably too slow. There is I'm just thinking now of the Stilton cheese that has a very, very, very long flock time. The Stilton or Stichelton, the raw milk version. When my friend Joe does the Stichelton, he's looking for a 40-45 minutes of flock time. It means during 45 minutes, the milk doesn't move at all, and it shows rapidly with big problem of rise of fat. And what they do in this type of cheese is they do a top stir. What the top stir is, they have a small paddle, and when the milk, after 20-25 minutes of um, flocculation, after adding the rennet, they with the paddle they gently move the top of the milk, pushing the top of the milk down very gently, not to damage the curd formations, and this permits to limit the loss of fat in. Cutting and stirring technique, of course, the more you damage, the more you produce fine particles, the more you lose bits of cheese. And in the bits of cheese, in the way, you will have fat globules. Temperature too warm during pressing as well. This is very much for the crumbly territorial cheese like cheddar, cheddar version. When we do the acidification before milling, in this case, the curd should be cooled and chilled before being salted and pressed. This is often the case in cheddar when they do the milling. Usually the name of the table that they use for the milling or the vat is called the cooling table. And traditionally, we have cold water circulating in the double jacket in order to cool down the temperature of the cheese down to 15, 16. And then you salt and you press. This permits to make the fat much more viscous. So when you press, the fat is not released by the little bit of weight that will still be evacuated in. So cooling the curd before pressing will permit you to save a lot of fat. And then during aging, we need to focus on the loss that you may have during the aging. Is based on the weight loss during this period. So what we do is we calculate the frat. So the weight loss during aging is the average weight of fresh cheese minus average weight of aged cheese divided by the average weight of fresh cheese. So the quantity, the mass of cheese that you have lost during the aging in percentage. Depending the type of cheese, we have target. So we cannot foresee a 0% weight loss, even in a plastic bag, in a plastic fantastic preservation bags for the aging of the cheese. We will still have some weight loss because the proteolysis leads to degradation of the components. So some components will disappear and will produce gas, will lose weight, but a 0% is not achievable. But if you can be between 5 and 12%, depending the type of cheese and depending the aging profile, that can be considered as a good target. If we take the example of the soft cheese, like Brie, Camembert, the bloomy rind cheese, we want a target of 5-6% weight loss. If we don't lose enough weight during aging, so less than 5% weight loss, the cheese rind will be too humid and we will have problems under the paper. If the cheese is losing more than 8%, that's a direct loss of money. That's the water, the cheese that evaporates on top. I worked recently in Slovenia where we identified a weight loss of 22% weight loss. This means that each time the cheesemaker was producing 5 cheese per day, at the end of the aging, he was putting one directly into the bin. So 20% of the production was disappearing. That's massive in terms of cost. The factors influencing the weight loss will be, first of all, the cave's condition, the aging conditions, a dry environment with an important temperature differential. The temperature differential is the difference between the room temperature and the coolant temperature. So depending the cooling system that you use in order to chill the room. If you use a gas, in this case, you know that the gas will be very cold. So the temperature differential will be much higher with a gas, will be much easier to control with an indirect cooling by running cold water or glycol system through the cooling element. Ventilation, highly ventilated. Aging room, particularly for hard cheese, must be still and quiet. Not enough cheese in the room, so we have a room that is underloaded. We don't have enough mass that permits the aging conditions to work properly. This happens often with the goat's milk or sheep's milk. Cheesemaker at the beginning and end of lactation, when the quantity of milk is very small. Lack of cares, turning, brushing, washing. The more you get cheese, the more you maintain the humidity in the environment. The microbial flora, the very intense proteolysis, leads to transformation of proteins into gas, CO2, ammonia, and so on. So you lose, the cheese disappear, tanks or leads because of the proteolytic activity. Cheese in post-acidification, there is a direct relationship between the post-acidification of the cheese and the weight loss during aging. The reason being, if the cheese post-acidifies and if the cheese is too acidic at unmolding, the texture of the cheese will be more porous, will be more open, so more sensitive to dehydration in the aging room. So a lactic cheese being very acidic will be drying out much quicker than a cheese that is stabilized in terms of pH. So be careful with the acidification control that will modify the texture of the cheese and will permit or not the dehydration of the cheese during the aging. This is the sorry, the control of the pH and the weight loss during the aging. So on the left we have a cheese that shows a post-acidification. That's the light red curve. The pH starts at 5.4 and 20 days after it ends up being 5.0505, and the dark red is the weight evolution that's going down much lower. The same cheese, but with a stabilized acidification. The light green pH starting at 5.25, but stable, shows a much lower weight loss during the aging. So you start with a cheese with the same weight of 650 grams, but after 20 days, we have 580 grams when we have a stabilized acidification, while we have 530 grams with cheese that post-acidifies. So it's a big, big difference. Consequence of post-acidification during aging. So we see the cheese at day 10 is oily, sticky. All the bugs develop quite fast. Day 20, the cheese shows underlying a very intense activity. And day 30, the paste is become so liquid that the liquid paste runs through and fall down. So, we lose yield directly because we lose bits of cheese. But also this cheese will be a nightmare to manipulate and flip and turn. So this will be even more important because you will throw away the batch. So the weight loss, the fat for this one will be 100%. Average values of total dry matter, fat and dry matter. this is an old French thing that we were studying, but those values are still valid. So on top you have the cheese, fromage, composition des fromages au démoulage, so that's the cheese composition at unmolding, in EST for total dry extract, and G divided by S is gras sur sec, so fat and dry extract, fat and dry matter. Then the next column is composition of whey for total dry matter, fat, and MAT is matière azotée totale, that's the total nitrogenous material, so that's proteins. The targeted yield, the average yield in terms of kilos of cheese per 100 kilos of milk, depending the quantity of cheese, the type of cheese that you make. And the yield recovery coefficient in terms of fat and proteins. So those value, and ESD, the total dry extract. But you need, this can be references to help you to see where you are. If you do the tracking system, where you should be. What we can notice is that the more we process the curd, so Emmental, Conti, all those dry cheese, you cut more, you steer more, so you damage more, so you have more chance to lose fat and proteins. So it's completely normal to have lower yield recovery for fat and for proteins for hard cooked cheese than for a traditional camembert that is less processed. So where you should collect a lot more fat and a lot more proteins. Some bibliography and questions. I've done it in 55 minutes. Normally it's a two-day course.
That's very good. Excellent there. So here, Alison has put in a question there. Can you open your chat box, Yvonne?
Yeah, can you mean?
Up the top there. Yeah.
Yep. The change when the milk is pasteurized. Technically, the pasteurization of the milk will, the main impact will be the mineralization availability. So the calcium availability during the coagulation. So we know that the pasteurization affects the mineral level in the milk. If you want to make a cheese that needs a lot of calcium with a strong rennet coagulation profile, like the hard cooked cheese, in this case, you should compensate with calcium chloride. But with the same pasteurized milk, if you are looking for production of more of a lactic or soft cheese, in this case, it might not be technically mandatory to add calcium back into the milk. So that pasteurization will not be the only parameter to consider. We'll have to know the age of the milk and also the type of cheese that we want to make. That's why we're going to navigate between 5 and 20 grams of calcium per 100 liters, depending the damage that we have done on the milk before, with the cooling temperature, the cooling time, the storage time, the pasteurization, the acidity, and the type of cheese that we want to make after.
Okay. Now, I want to clarify that I'm not a cheesemaker, but I did have a question about pumping of the warm milk, because most people have to purchase their milk in and it will be chilled.
Yeah, I'm sorry for them.
Yeah, well, some people
in this case, there is no options.
Yes, yeah.
Options. You must apart in very, very specific milk production like Conte, where it's forbidden to chill the milk lower than 10 degrees Celsius. Yes. The rest of the world says you must store the milk and transfer the milk, if you sell the milk, at a temperature lower than, let's say, 6 degrees C.
Right. Yeah. Here we are. Paul's asked there, do all of these calculations to track the weight loss we need to measure fat and protein in milk, weight of cheese produced, weight of cheese at selling, fat and protein and moisture in the cheese? Is there anything else?
Yeah, volume of milk and density, if you want to be precise.
Wow.
So technically, we can do here to assess, in order to assess the cheese making efficiency, we need to be able to fill all the green cells. And in here, you can see that all those values are made per 100 liters of milk. But if we want to be very precise with a bigger volume of milk, in this case, we would need to change volume of milk by mass of milk for the yield control. So this is the control for the cheese at unmolding. So this validates your cheese making efficiency. And then at the end is the fat, the weight loss during aging, weight of fresh cheese and weight of aged cheese. And that's pretty much it. Yeah. If you can identify what you lose when you make the cheese and what you lose when you age the cheese, after the other loss will be cheese that are falling off, will be cheese that you send for testing, will be losses that you can control kind of easily.
Yep. Okay. That's really excellent. Thanks, Paul, for that question. That was really good. I noted that Alison put in that box earlier that if anybody would like a copy of Yvonne's yield template in Excel, just email her there. She's got her email address, alison.allisonlansley@gmail.com. So there we go.
And you will have to work a little bit. It's not a straightforward kind of information. There's a lot of formulas into it that needs to be adjusted depending the type of cheese, type of milk, and so on. So if it gives you values that are not really coherent, don't hesitate to get back to me to review and to adapt the template to your system, to your production.
And just also keep in mind that when Yvonne comes out, he is sponsored by ASCA. And if you want further information, contact Alison regarding that. Okay, so with that, we're spot on 1 hour. Yeah, so we haven't had any more questions coming through. So here we go. Mitch has asked, what effect does the size of the batch being made have on the yield of the cheese? For example, are you better off making 2 by 500 batches of cheese or 1 by 10,000 litres?
That's a very good question, and that the answer depends on the type of cheese that you are going to make. One of the characteristics being the pH at molding. Example, if you make brie, that's exactly the point that I was going to underline. If you make the soft, bloomy type cheese like this one, like brie, you have a molding pH at about 6.15, 6.2, 6.25. It means that you want to mold the cheese in a very short time slot because starter culture are racing. So in this case, it's much better to use smaller vats times 2 times 500 liters, because you can stagger them when you add starter culture with a 5 or 10 minutes difference in between. So the time that you mold you dump tip up the first vat, the second vat is not over acidifying. The problem with the big vat in this case, the time that you start ladling or molding the beginning of the vat until the end, the time slot will be too big. So you will have a big standard deviation between cheese one and the first cheese and the last cheese. So for 1,000 liters, you make about 500 cheese. So in this case, between the cheese one and the cheese 500, the pH will be completely different at molding. So we'll have it will stay too long in the cheese vat, so will demineralize and will of course affect the texture of the cheese, but also the yield, because the more you demineralize in vat, the more fragile the curds, the more loss, the more fine particles you lose. So that really depends on the type of cheese. And as an example, even the very big guys that make soft cheese, they always do it in smaller volumes. So either small conveyor, some small tip type of vat that works on a conveyor. And in this case, those vats like Alma, it's a 400 liters vat, or it can be an Alma conveyor belt of 500 liters usually, but most of the time not more than that. And they are looking for a maximum of 5 minutes from beginning and end of molding. When you use a tip-up system, the whole vat is molded at once. So you have no standard, well, much less standard deviation in this kind of system.
Okay, very good. So thank you so much, Yvonne. I know that you're really exhausted.
Well, not quite. It's just the beginning of the day. It's going to be worse at the end of the day.
Okay.